Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this idea of directionality, and I'm going to be particularly talking about the idea of using concepts of meaning and purpose, not just as a therapeutic tool, but as an integrating basis for therapy itself. So the idea is that we can actually bring together lots of different therapeutic ideas, whether it's psychodynamic, CBT, Gestalt, existential, that they can all, as well as ideas from coaching and from other orientations, that we can bring those together around a basic idea of meaning and purpose. But I'm particularly going to be focusing on more related to purpose, really, perhaps, than meaning, and more around the idea of people being fundamentally purpose-directed, that in our being, we are always being towards particular goals, particular intentions, that there's a directionality towards our being, that we strive towards things, and particularly we strive towards things that ultimately are meaningful for us. And that actually what I want to suggest is that all the different models of therapy in different ways do talk about that process of people as being striving towards things. And in many ways there's a shared understanding, whether it's CBT, psychodynamic, humanistic, there are some shared principles around how people get messed up and how people can heal themselves and work together, that actually if we can identify, we can bring together these different orientations. A lot of my work to date has been around the idea of pluralism, and the idea that rather than having separate schools that are kind of fighting each other and saying different things, that in many ways a lot of the different schools are saying something quite similar. And I think a lot of that is around direction. So most of this is based around work that I've done in a recent book around integrating counselling and psychotherapy, around this idea of directionality, synergy as a bringing together of different things and social change. As I was saying, I think in many ways the different therapies that we have, the different models of therapy are like the blind men and the elephant, that they are all feeling different parts of this animal and describing it in different ways. So cognitive approach says that people's problems are around dysfunctional thought, and psychodynamics approach is about past experiences, humanistic about people being split from their self-concept, but actually maybe there's a lot more commonality, the elephant in the room, so to speak, than we would imagine. So I'm going to talk about this concept of directionality, go on to talk about different kind of phases of directionality and the idea that we can think about directionality in terms of different components of it. Talk about a kind of structural model that's there in a lot of different theories, particularly people like Bill Powers, who've developed a hierarchy of purposes to understand the way that we're purpose-oriented beings, show how that can relate to psychological distress, and then go on to talk about it as a common framework for the psychological therapies. And just the last thing that I want to do then after that is to talk also about social change and how this way of understanding human being can also be a model for understanding social change. So not only, I think, the model I'm going to present can integrate the different therapies, but it can also integrate an understanding of social justice and social change. But the starting point for the model really is, and it's interesting how it relates to the idea of being as meaning-oriented, because I guess the part of meaning-orientedness that this particularly connects with is the idea of purposefulness, and the way that as beings we are moving towards purposes, that there are things that are purposeful for us. I guess meaning in that sense is slightly different. Meaning is about the kind of connections to something higher and something beyond ourselves, and purposes can be both within ourselves and kind of self-enclosed, as well as towards something higher. Martin Buber, the existential philosopher, talks about directions as the primal tension of the soul, which moves it to choose and realise certain possibilities. That are directions, and we can argue about where those directions come from, about our wants, our desires, our hopes, our aims. These movements that we have out, Virginia was talking about, these movements that we have kind of going out towards the world from us, these strivings that mean that we choose certain possibilities in our lives. And when we're talking about directionality then, and when we're talking about this idea of directions, we're talking about something that is teleological, something that is purposive, the different purposes And directionality suggests as a kind of ontological, it's not describing it as kind of some of us have more motivation than others, it's suggesting that ontologically the very essence of our being and what differentiates us from other things in the world, like a chair and a table or a computer, is that we have these purposes, we have this kind of teleological moving forward towards different possibilities, and that we strive towards things in a way that a table doesn't strive. A computer may function and it may calculate and it may do lots of things, but it doesn't have a purpose, it doesn't have a reason. So directionality means that we're always on the way to somewhere, that within us there is always those strivings towards different things, whether it's towards family, whether it's towards connectedness, whether it's towards hope. That there's a constant moving out and being here at this conference is about learning things, perhaps it's about making connections with people. Directionality emphasises perhaps the more motivational and emotional aspects of meaning rather than the more kind of cognitive side. It's about where it is we're trying to go to. Directionality is also about agency. It's about how we actively strive towards things. That in essence we are, again, in contrast to other kind of entities, that as human beings, we're agentic beings that make change happen and strive towards something. And that very much linked in phenomenology, that it's for a reason, that when we understand things, and particularly if we think about clinical work, that when we understand our clients, that even if we're looking at something that from the outside might seem very dysfunctional, somebody, for instance, who really wants relatedness in their life, but yet seems to cut themselves off, or if I'm working with a client who's talking about that they want to have a passionate life, they want to be alive, they want to have things that really matter for them, and yet somehow they don't seem to be able to get out of their room, there's something holding them back. That therapeutically, and in many ways the kind of synchronon of therapies, is that we understand that part that is holding them back as something which at some level has some intentionality, some purpose, some agency. That it's a part of them that is both wanting to go out and encounter the world and be there in the world, and that there is another part of them that is in somehow putting the brakes on that. And what we do as therapists is often try and understand the reasons for that, the intelligibility and the purpose behind it. So a directional understanding of human beings is a bit like, I kind of understand it a bit like a delta. We talk about being as a river, but directionality means that there's not just one directionality, it's not one thing, that there's multiple directions, and that within us at any one time there's multiple directions moving in different ways, striving towards different things. And often those directions can be compatible, and that they're working together, and there's a kind of smoothness and there's a comfort in our life because our directions have a unity of purpose and focus. But where there's psychological distress and where there's psychological problems, that perhaps what's happening there is that rather than having these different streams moving forward, that directionality is more like a torrent. That the different streams in our life, the different desires, the different wants, are pulling against each other, they're running against each other, they're clashing. There's a turbulence there. That means that somebody is both striving for one thing, that somebody wants connection, they want to be out in the world, they want to have hope, they want to have life, but there's also a part of them that is striving for something else, maybe safety, maybe comfort, maybe running away from something, running towards something. So directionality introduces this idea that when we understand psychological well-being and distress, I'll come back to that a lot of distress is around conflicting directions, and the way that our directions can sometimes pull us apart. So that when people are suffering, and very much rooted in a kind of meaning-oriented understanding, we don't understand suffering as somebody going off the rails, some kind of pathology that makes no sense. We understand pathology as a meaning-oriented being, striving towards meaning and purpose, and yet the purposes that they're striving towards in one way are running against the purposes that they're striving forward in another way, and that leads to distress. And in fact, what I want to suggest, and I'm going to say, is that I think that understanding is at the basis of all our different psychological therapies. A lot of our work around pluralism was the idea of goals and people being goal-oriented. And I think goals are very useful, and we kind of talk about that in the meaning-oriented field as well. But there's something about goals and its emphasis on kind of conscious purposes that we can state goals and make them explicit. I think for all of us, we have a sense that there's something a bit limited and a bit mechanistic and a bit too kind of overt about goals. And that what goals misses out is the more kind of implicit, subtle yearnings, the hopes. Again, Victoria's talking about kind of the emotionality and the way that kind of being in a mood has a certain directionality to it. But we wouldn't talk about, goals. Client of mine who's maybe kind of locking herself in a room because she's terrified of the outside world, wouldn't be meaningful to say she has a goal of not going outside. And yet there is some directionality there, there's some direction, there's something that she wants to achieve or wants to avoid in that process of kind of staying where she is. So when we're talking about directionality, we're not just talking about conscious goals, we're talking about both the conscious and the unconscious. And in a sense, that term allows us to think about them both, the conscious goals that we have and also the unconscious goals that we have. And also very much, if you're at the workshop on focusing, directionality can be very much embodied in the sense that it's that bodily yearning and focusing, and Jen then talk a lot about this, the way that our bodies have a direction. And when we work with clients, we often listen to those very subtle callings of the body that want safety or want stimulation or want closeness or want touch or want intimacy. So that many of the things that drive us and drive our clients can't be stated as explicit goals that somebody is striving for this. It's those subtle yearnings that often are the most important that people are being towards, and those embodied meanings. Also very important when we're talking about directionality and directions is not just something inside of us. Directions as with intentionality and phenomenology are a reaching out into the world. And that's really important because it means that when we talk about well-being, and when we think about well-being, and I'll suggest that well-being is essentially the capacity to actualize these directions, the capacity to move forward in the world, that it's not just about what goes on inside of us. There can be ways in which we make that difficult for ourselves due to earlier experiences and how we try and do things. But also very much the world that we're in can limit our capacity to actualise those directions. Somebody who's, Emmy was talking about Brexit, and if somebody, like most of us, has a very important direction towards safety and to feeling at home in a world and to feeling connectedness. Something like Brexit, which breaks that, that's not, as Emmy was saying, about some kind of interpersonal disjunction that means that somebody can't get to where they want to. It's very much about in the world directions being blocked and being limited by the world that someone inhabits. Rollo May, the existential therapist, talks about, when he talks about choice, he also talks about kind of like the different phases, like wish, will, intentionality. And there's a number of people like the psychoproshaxin, the Clementus, and psychoproshaxin. People talk about these kind of different phases of motivation. And so it becomes quite an interesting way of starting to think about how these different therapies come together. So we have stages of change, we have the Gestalt cycle, and then we can think about, so far I've just been talking about directionality, this kind of movement, this energy that we have towards different things. But we can think about it in different kind of phases, the different elements of it that can help us think about how these different therapies might fit. I'm sure, have you all seen this? Fleabag, which was this wonderful Channel 4 show. I just want to give you an example. There's this lovely bit where she falls in love with, what's his name? Andrew Scott. Andrew Scott, she falls in love with this priest. I was watching this with my kids and they're all kind of salivating over Andrew Scott, and they absolutely adore him. Everything's fantastic. But it was, thinking about this kind of what I've been talking about as a directional art, but our desires, these directions emerge. And when, Fleabag she meets this priest, and she's not kind of consciously thinking, right, I'm really attracted to him, but there is something that emerges in her at a very embodied level around that desire, that kind of initial, there's almost not a word for it because it is at such a kind of a primal level of this, perhaps the psychoanalytic concept of desire is the best one. And all the phases, I'm going to talk about 9 different phases quickly, but they're all kind of, they could be there, they couldn't be there. I think emergence has to be there, but then there's an awareness. She recognises, she doesn't recognise it at first, but she's talking to her sister, and then she recognises that actually she's really attracted to this priest, which is kind of really weird but it's there. And of course in therapy, and particularly the reflective and insight-based therapies, we do a lot of work around helping people be aware of their directions and what it is that they really want. What are the things that they most fundamentally want in their lives? And sometimes clients need things like space and reflection and working with transference to really explore what those directions are. And then there's something around evaluation, thinking, is this something good for me or not? Does this work for me? You know, she's thinking, wow, I'm really attracted to this priest. And does that make sense in my life? He's a priest, you know, what's going to happen? And often when these directions emerge, and as we become aware of them, and of course we need awareness to move on to evaluation, then we can start thinking about, is this something that I want? How does this fit with other directions in my life and other things that I might want or might not want? And then very importantly, in the existential world, we talk a lot about this, is around intention, is around choices. You know, up to this point, there hasn't been any choices. This is kind of emergent, or perhaps to some extent we can choose around awareness and evaluation. But we're beginning to move into action and actually thinking about, how do I put this? You know, how do I meet this priest? How do I find some time on my own with him when I can kind of chat him up and things like that? And then we move into planning, the phases of planning and thinking about how we actually do that. And then action, and actually making things happen and taking these kind of desires into that action phase of actually doing it, and then feedback, using feedback. Is this a kind of positive thing? Is this guy actually attracted to me or not? And a different model is we can start to think about, you know, where goals and desires and different concepts fit together, because one of the problems about goals is that goals really just defines this second phase of this directional process. The goals is about when we have an intention and say, right, I'm going to do something. But if we just work with goals in a lot of coaching, for instance, there's a big focus on goals. But what we're not working with so much is this kind of cauldron of seething desires, as Freud would have called it, these wishes, all these things that go on that clients often need space for and that they need to be able to explore. And that where we've done research, we did a paper recently on clients' experiences working with goals in therapy, big qualitative study. And what we found is that clients were saying that where they had intentions and where they knew what they wanted to do, it was great having goals because they could write them down and they could state them and that they could work towards the kind of predefined goals. But clients were also saying, and different clients were saying, that where they weren't really sure what they wanted, it was really hard to define goals. And they found it sometimes intrusive to be asked, what are your goals? Because they really didn't know, they were still kind of working them out. So we can also start to think about how the different therapies come together because they focus on different phases of this process. In a sense, this is where psychodynamic and humanistic approaches focus, particularly. They focus on the emergence, the evaluation, and particularly the awareness of desires and hopes and what we want, and really trying to get down to the essence of what is it that you really want in your life. And with this humanistic approach, for instance, what is it you authentically want in your life? Not what have other people told you what you want, but is this an authentic desire? And then what you get is the existential work, which I think is really interesting because often we work on that kind of intention phase of choices and actually choosing. And perhaps even rather than necessarily starting here, we would sometimes start here and say, you know, you don't have to have all this fully mapped out. Sometimes you make your choices, you take action, you see the feedback, and then on the basis of that, you can work out some of what those desires and aspirations actually are. And then further over on this side, you have more the cognitive behavioural approaches, which do focus, for instance, on kind of structured methods for evaluation, planning, how to use feedback. The behavioural approaches use feedback. But in a sense, all these different approaches, although we can think about them as very different kinds of therapies, when we think about it in a directional sense, that they're all doing something similar, in the sense that they're all trying to help people move along this directional arc, to actualise that all the different therapies help clients to actualise their different directions and to move forward in their lives and to find better ways of doing something. I think something else that's interesting about this directional arc is that if we think about all these different components as being pretty important to people in their lives, and that to actualise the direction that we have to, in some senses, do all these different things, then we can think about with ourselves or with our clients, what phases of this directional arc are we good at doing, and what are the ones that we struggle with more. Where are our strengths and where are our limits? So for instance, if I think about myself, that I'm pretty good at kind of coming up with the desires, and I'm pretty good at being aware of what it is that I want. That I have a good sense generally of what it is I want. But I know for myself that when it gets to kind of evaluating and thinking things through really carefully and then planning, I just get really bored, and I just think it's like having to weigh things up, doing tables, the pros and the cons. I don't really like doing that. I'd much rather in my own kind of life often go from awareness straight to action and make things happen. Sometimes that works, but the problem for me is that sometimes things really don't work out because they are just so badly planned, and I'm just so, I'd rather just do it, but sometimes skipping that, missing things out. So, it's something to think for yourself, what are you good at? I'm quite good at feedback. And I think the other extreme of that is that, so I think some people tend to miss out evaluation planning. Some people are the opposite, that they just spend ages on evaluating things, planning things, thinking things through really carefully. And so carefully that actually there's no time left for action at the end of it. There's just that kind of paralysis by analysis. And I think our clients need a certain amount of all these different phases to make those directions happen and come to life. So that's one way of thinking about directionality. And then there's another way of thinking about directionality, which is a more kind of structured. It's kind of turning it, rotating it 90 degrees clockwise. And there's a number of people like Bill Powers, who I'm not sure how well known he is, but he developed something called control theory. And he did some very interesting work about this. He had this kind of hierarchy of purposes. And a number of different people have proposed something quite similar. And I think there's something very intuitive that in many ways it kind of makes sense how we think about things. And the idea of this hierarchy is essentially that there are certain, there's lots of different purposes that exist, or different directions that exist. And some of them are the kind of most fundamental ones to us. The things that we really deeply care about, the things that deeply in our soul drive us towards particular places, whether it's, for instance, social justice. If I think about the things that are highest order for me, a care about social justice. But then there's also things like, for instance, pleasure, connectedness. I mean, he was talking about that, there's a very important higher order. And we know from the research, and Roy is, was one of the first people to really put that down, that sense of belongingness is a really fundamental higher order direction. And that these kind of are at the top, if you like. Obviously, again, it's a bit formal, but that we can think about these kind of higher order directions, and then we can think about how people move towards it, and that so we can have purposes and directions that are ways of getting to these higher order directions. So, for instance, somebody might want relatedness. I guess we all want relatedness to our lives, but then how do we do that? What are our directions towards relatedness? Somebody, for instance, it might be about having good romantic relationships. And then it might also be time with family, and it might also be, somebody might also, might be working with someone, it might be us, casual sex, or different ways might be a way of trying to move towards that relatedness. Then with each of these things, we can think about how do we do that? Maybe we go on dates, maybe we get in touch with an ex, and so it kind of goes down. And Powers talks about these 11 different levels, right down to kind of moving your hand. And he would say that, even a hand movement, writing something, as you're doing now, or thinking about something now, you could trace it up to what is the highest order purpose direction. Maybe learning, maybe about being connected to people, maybe about growth in your life. And it raises an interesting question really about what are the kind of highest order directions. A lot of theories would say that pleasure is the highest order direction, that there's a kind of basic, everything leads up ultimately to being about pleasure. But then, Carol's work, Amy's work, different people's work have emphasised more an alternative thing. They said, well, it's not just about pleasure. That actually what people want most, for instance, and I'm sure a lot of people in the conference would say, it's about meaning. And that actually what we strive most for in our lives is meaning. Or authenticity. Self-determination theory, which is a very interesting humanistic psychological theory, talks about autonomy, competence, and relatedness as the three highest order directions. And nearly all the different theories, and there's lots of different models, and I kind of reviewed them for the book I did, but a lot of them do talk about relatedness, as Amy was saying, and that ultimately our desires are for connectedness. I think Frankl's quite interesting on this. Just to say safety, I think, it's not mentioned, Maslow mentions it. And of course what we're talking about here is different from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because he says we need one before the other, and there may be some truth in that. I think it's been challenged empirically. But what we're saying here is actually there's multiple higher order needs that may exist. Now Frankl's interesting. If you read Frankl, he kind of says, well, Freud talks about pleasure and Adler talks about power, but really the highest order one is meaning. And different theories say that different things are higher, and you could say that pleasure is the highest order of meaning, is about pleasure, or pleasure is about meaning. I think as a clinician, and when you're working with people, that in a sense we don't need to get into an argument about which is the highest order, because if a client comes in and says, the most important thing for me in my life is authenticity, you're not going to say, well, actually, no, it's not. It's about relatedness, or you should strive for that, or And actually, Isaiah Berlin, the pluralistic philosopher, is really interesting on this, because he says that a democracy is essentially about allowing people to have their own highest order directions, and that we don't say it's about this or it's about that. We don't say it's about safety. We don't say our society is about pleasure. Democracy is about allowing a pluralism of highest order directions to flourish. And of course it might be different for different individuals. There's different models about, we could argue that what is our unique fingerprint is about those ways in which there are particular directions that are most important for us, and then how we go about fulfilling them. So from that model, as I said before, I think psychological well-being we could understand as the actualization of direction. But we're not talking about all the direction. We're talking about, it's not about actualizing that direction towards writing something down, or that as a purpose. It's about those highest order ones, that in a state of psychological well-being, we're actualizing the directions that are most significant, or in terms of this conference, kind of meaningful for us. Meaningful directions are the ones that are those at the kind of highest order. And when we're talking about actualising, we're not just talking about getting there, and that's really important. It's not just about having those things in our lives like competence, it's all about the journey. And we know from the research that kind of the process of moving towards our directions, of actualising them, is as important as their attainment. So we're talking about things like just having a sense of direction, knowing for ourselves what it is. And by sense, I think, is a nice word. It's not about just cognitive knowledge, it's also about feeling in an embodied way, a sense of where it is we're going, kind of knowing those highest order directions and having some sense of coherence in our lives about where we fit in. And it's about feeling that they're attainable. There's a lot of research around self-competence, whether people feel that they can actually move towards the things that they want or not. And if people don't feel that, then that can be associated with distress. Progress, moving. That a good life is one in which, not one where we're achieving the relatedness and competence, but one in which we feel that we're moving towards. When I think about that idea of kind of moving along those directions, like going for a walk, it's not about getting a destination, it's that pleasure that you get of moving along those directions towards something.